Roman society was primarily reliant on free labor from people who had no rights or property and were entrusted to the whims of their masters, where they would be worked to death, starved, tortured, and occasionally even killed for fun. Although you have probably seen Russell Crowe portray one in a film, it's likely that you are unaware of the true extent of its brutality. In ancient Rome, slaves performed jobs other than domestic or agricultural labor. They performed almost every type of menial task imaginable. Slaves were often categorized as either urban or rural. Their jobs ranged from cleaning and cooking to silver mining. Slaves on country estates could be employed in smithing, baking, security, and other non-domestic jobs. Urban slaves occasionally worked for businessmen as managers and accountants. If you were a slave who had been taken prisoner of war, you might have been sold to the general public and given jobs like tending to public buildings, putting out fires, or even carrying out executions. Some Roman slaves worked as a master's property from the time of their birth until their deaths. However, the fate of those who could cough up a little bucks was better. The earliest and simplest way for a slave to become free was to simply receive freedom from their master, possibly through a will, though this usually required some kind of ceremony or price. Some sold themselves into slavery in order to pay off their debts over a predetermined period of time, which led to the creation of slaves. Should that be the case, your contract's completion would result in your release. Giving up peculium that they controlled while under a master's rule allowed slaves to also amass wealth. This kind of riches could be money or real estate. Slaves could also use this as a tool to buy their freedom, even though it was still nominally within their master's ownership. Nevertheless, slaves did not suddenly become free and acculturated Roman citizens after purchasing their freedom. Following the manumission process, also known as purchasing your freedom, these former slaves started to resemble conditional citizens and started doing business with their former masters. They were prohibited from running for public office as well. Furthermore, you had no chance at all of buying your way out of servitude if you were under 30. In the 1st century CE, slaves under the age of 30 could not be liberated, according to the Roman lawyer Gaius. In any era, it was inhumane and horrible to be a slave. Roman slaves were also not an exception. Being the owner's property, slaves had expectations about how they should act. If they didn't, the repercussions would have been nightmare material. Plautus, a dramatist from the 2nd century, gives slave Messinio the following lines in Menechmi: stripes, fetters, the mill, weariness, hunger, bitter cold, fine pay for idleness. That's the same thing I'm terrified of. Therefore, being good is undoubtedly preferable to being wicked. I detest actual flogging, but I don't like tongue lashings. Whoa. Slave owners had the power to severely beat and punish their charges, using anything from whippings to chains and fetters. Additionally, masters were free to sell their slaves, put them to death by hanging or crucifixion, and assign the most dreadful labor as a form of punishment. And they would brand you if you attempted to flee, oh dear. Strict rations of bread sound the least delicious, don't they? It's obvious that slaves, who constituted the lowest class in Roman society, did not eat like monarchs. Cato the Elder was a soldier, statesman, and historian who lived in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. He wrote about the daily requirements of agricultural slaves, including what kind of food and drink they should be provided. Cato believed that slaves needed to be given wheat so they could make bread. Bread had to be given to bound slaves, however, as they were unable to grind their own grain. More flour and wine were required for the summertime field labor of enslaved people. We would also want more wine if we were forced to labor in the sweltering Roman fields for the entire summer without pay. Slaves often consumed what Cato called relish in addition to bread and wine. But this Roman relish was nothing like what you'd get on a hot dog from a baseball park. It was made of olives, not pickle. Slaves supplemented their nutrition in the 1st century BCE by growing their own crops and harvesting fruits and vegetables from the wild. Urban gardens could be started by domestic slaves. They could, of course, always take up their master's leftovers. Some enslaved men and women had the opportunity to become prisoners of war and criminals in the gladiatorial arena. But the majority of them served as a pool of forced laborers without compensation. The original gladiatorial bouts, which were primarily composed of slaves, date back to the 3rd century BCE. Spartacus, a well-known slave, received his training in a gladiator school in Rome. Furthermore, let's just say that these gladiator training institutes weren't exactly sleepaway camps, even if the thought of attending a gladiator school appeals to you. Although they were treated more or less like captives, gladiators in training did get food, medical care, and instruction in specialized equipment. These performers were not frequently killed because they were viewed more like investments than as living individuals. According to archaeologist Wolfgang Neubauer, they were too precious. To fight as gladiators, a large number of former slaves signed up. After purchasing their release, also known as manumission, they were left with few options and effectively returned to slavery, taking on the gladiatorial oath to be executed by sword, set ablaze, and shackled. All right, we have to acknowledge that the gladiator oath is a rather strict one. However, you have to assume that if emancipated slaves were sincerely offering to fight to the death, conditions for them had to be rather appalling, living in chambers that were usually far away from their masters and overseers was one feature that both urban and country slaves had in common. Even now, domestic help continued to reside in their master's home, sometimes even getting enough sleep to attend to their requirements during the night. However, a concerted effort was made to keep free men and women and slaves apart. A slave's quarters were typically shared with other slaves and situated close to storage facilities. Think of a Romanized bunk bed next to a garage. You probably didn't have the best sense of style if you were a Roman slave. Simple clothes, akin to that worn by impoverished free men and women, was required of slaves. Every 2 years, masters gave a 3.5-foot tunic and cloak. It would seem that you would be out of luck if you had a long torso. Additionally, nice shoes should be given every 2 years. Consider acquiring a single pair of shoes every 2 years? And this was back when duct tape was non-existent. To make matters worse, male slaves were prohibited from donning the one item of clothing that epitomized Roman style, togas. It was also banned for female slaves to wear dresses called stolas over their tunics. Seneca claims that the Roman Senate once debated requiring slaves to wear a uniform in order to better identify them in society. In the end, they opted against it in order to keep the number of slaves who belonged to their ranks a secret, chilling to the bone. Why should the knowledge of the number of slaves by the slaves worry the Roman Senate? Because, well, there were a lot of them, really a lot. Tension and anxieties of the outside world came from Roman society's massive slave population. Romans had good reason to be concerned. Roman Empire slave conflicts were on the rise. Furthermore, it was just a matter of time until widespread uprisings started to emerge. Apart from small-scale conflicts, there was a well-known widespread slave uprising that actually threatened Roman civilization. Recall the slave Spartacus from our previous discussion, the one who was sent to gladiator school to train. That same individual went on to become the leader of a slave uprising in which 70,000 slaves and supporters engaged the Roman army in combat. Those are some impressive figures. Between 73 and 71 BCE, Spartacus and his army engaged in multiple battles with the Roman army, defeating them 3 times before his death. Sources claim that despite being wounded by a spear thrust to the thigh, Spartacus bravely battled to the very end. He dropped to one knee, raised a shield in front of his attackers, and repelled them until he and a large number of his supporters were surrounded and fell. Even though Spartacus and his army ultimately defeated, their battle was in vain. A few legal actions were taken to guarantee, or at least promote, better treatment of slaves because of fears of future uprisings. In contrast to other historical slavery systems, Roman slavery was not based on race or ethnicity. Additionally, the total number of slaves changed daily. Thousands of men and women were sold into slavery following the Punic Wars in the 3rd and 2nd century BCE. Many of them worked as artisans, craftsmen, and agricultural laborers. Greece, Egypt, North Africa, Gaul, and Asia Minor were among the many non-Romans who were sold into slavery by Rome as its empire grew. Rome also began to take an increasing number of prisoners of war. I guess Rome was a slave nation with equal opportunities. Manual labor was not reserved for female slaves. However, they frequently carried out private tasks on behalf of affluent and privileged Roman ladies. It is possible to train slaves to do hair and makeup, akin to an unpaid glam squad that is compelled to work. Even affluent Roman women were given wet nurses by other female slaves. So, that breast lift looks awful. The wife of Empress Livia Augustus had almost 1,000 attendants. Many of them were slaves, both male and female. In addition to being subject to the caprices of their male masters, female slaves could also suffer from sexual abuse. In certain cases, the lords would even demand payment for the male slaves to commit these horrible crimes on the helpless females. Given all of this agony, it makes sense that both male and female slaves were eager to enter the gladiatorial arena. Slavery was a major component of the Roman economy and was widespread. However, views on the proper status of slaves in Roman culture differed. Seneca the Younger and other Stoic writers discussed the relationship between a slave and a master, highlighting the human aspect of the former and the paternalistic and benevolent duty of the latter. Seneca said that a slave who came from the same stock as you is greeted with smiles from the skies and experiences life and death on an equal footing with you. Epictetus, a former slave who lived and taught in Rome, advocated for owners to treat their slaves fairly. Slaves were considered nobles by Epictetus. But freedom and nobility are the same thing? Not quite, I guess. Any civilization that relies on slave labor is undoubtedly not a just or sustainable one. Fortunately, slavery ended with the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 CE. How do you feel about the struggles that Roman slaves endured?